focusing your brain on the right things, but fewer things. So just as we mentioned before, your example at Microsoft about the leadership principles model, that's a form of attention, which is not asking everyone to look at the whole horizon of possibilities, but picking the things that are most important. So focusing attention, very important. Generation means the active interaction between your need to retrieve and recall information, not just recognize it, but actually retrieve it from working memory, to pull it back out and to be able to apply it. Teaching is frankly one of the greatest ways in terms of generation. And another example is people that will I used to do this in college. I didn't realize what a nerd I was at the time, now looking back on it, but I would make my own tests in preparation for a test. Right, so I would force myself to recall the information before getting into the situation of actually taking a test. And then the recall was easier for me. So generation is when you are requiring yourself to, reach back into the brain and pull information forward again. Emotion is when you connect the feelings that you have about a particular topic to that topic. So probably the most classic example of that is storytelling. So if you were, describing a country or a group of people or, a type of vacation that you like to take, storytelling is an interesting way to evoke emotion, not just evoke recall, but evoke emotion. And the emotion itself makes recall stickier. It makes it more likely that it will encode in a stronger way and that the neural network associated with all of that becomes stronger. And then this is the one where I really screwed things up the most in my corporate life, was spacing. Think of all the classes that you and I have been to where we went off somewhere for 3 days and then we came back to the workplace having been immersed in whatever we were being immersed in. Well, it turns out from a learning perspective that the brain much prefers learning something, stepping away from it, and not actively thinking about it, than going back to it again, doing the same thing, interacting with it, generating it, attributing emotion to it or integrating emotion, then stopping, going away, coming back again. So I'll give you a practical example. Let's say you had 4 hours of time that you were going to allocate to studying for a test. One version might be the test is on Friday. You take 4 hours on Thursday evening. You cram like crazy and you bluff your way through the test. On Friday, you manage to pass. And the moment you're done, kind of what happens, it all falls right back out of, your head. The other possibility is you might say, on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I'm going to allocate 1 hour a night to study the material, only 1 hour, and then not only spacing, but rest. So it turns out rest plays an important component in the clearing the clutter and helping the brain focus on the most important things. That spacing, just that simple, not introducing more time, not even changing how you study, but introducing spacing across those 4 hours. And the difference on the performance on the test on Friday is not remarkably different. The difference is 4 weeks later, when asked to recall and reapply what you learned in that week running up to the test. And so for me, in corporate work, we're not typically trying to teach people something just to pass the test and be done with it. We're usually trying to help someone build a career. We're usually trying to help someone become more proficient and or expert in a domain of study or in a job assignment. So we actually want it, to last. So I would say spacing, if I could even just pick one of the 4 out of ages, if corporate work could design more spacing into the work that we do, that then causes us to use the A, the G, and the E in more frequency, but in distance apart from one another, the likelihood that we would help people retain information goes way up.
It's a great example, I think, of the kind of models that we should be looking to understand and apply. I was thinking while you were talking there about some research that I've done this year on sleep. So there's a lot of great work being done on sleep and the importance of sleep, and obviously it's a very, very high risk thing for a mammal to do in the wild, and yet we have to do it. It's so critical to so much of how we function, including how we learn. And I don't remember ever considering sleep in the programs that we built at Microsoft and Oracle. In fact, probably quite the reverse. We probably really hindered people's ability to rest and reflect and recover. And it turns out that's one of the most important pieces of learning. So thanks for sharing that with us. What can you share any examples of where you see organizations putting Aegis or similar tools to work?
So I don't want this to sound overly self-serving, but I do want to be true to our own work at NLI around how we approach instructional design. So what we coach our clients to do, whether they are implementing a program that we've already developed or they want to create a custom program with us for themselves, we will absolutely do a couple of things. We'll ask them, well, I guess I should say that work is constrained by all kinds of things, and so there is no perfect, environment for sure. But in terms of factoring things in, we would suggest to a client, look, if there's something you want to roll out to the entirety of an organization, you're better off doing an hour or two per week over the course of 4 weeks than you would be to bring everybody together for a day. Even if that means doing it virtually, because you can add attention and emotion and generation, not just spacing, into the mix, particularly if you do these in intact teams or with a leader in the organization sort of leading the discussion, because the motivation associated with performing within your own team causes the recall and the emotive state to be higher. So we see this all the time with clients as they're deploying. I mean, Microsoft would be an example, but other firms of similar magnitude and size and complexity that, we would think, oh, well, we need to choose the most complicated way of going about doing this. And sometimes that's not true. Sometimes it's breaking it down into smaller, manageable chunks, spacing it out over time, allowing intact work groups to have the discussion together and to do it in a distributed way over the arc of time. Call that, 3, 4, 5 weeks. It's a very common practice that we use with our clients, and it's so much less disruptive to scheduling and the flow of work and just the normal business routines that we all have to keep going.
Yeah, and I think technology is really helping as well, because you can do that spacing, you can connect people in more sort of convenient ways. I'm seeing a lot of technology emerge around nudging people to kind of re-engage, which is quite interesting in the learning space as well. Time for a few more questions, and I'm really interested to know, Mary, after your time here with NLI, are there other things that you'd wish you'd known as a talent practitioner that you've learned either from your work with NLI or your work collaborating with NLI's customers?
Two things that come to mind. One is just a piece of advice for those that are listening. You are not alone. Would be the first thing I would say to you. The commonality of both frustration and opportunity is everywhere. And it is industry agnostic. It has nothing to do with the size of the organization. We are at such an interesting, it's been written about as like the fourth industrial revolution, but we're at just such an interesting inflection point around how people accomplish work, what information actually is, that now it's sort of a bit of a repivot back toward how useful are humans, and where do they serve their best? Where are they optimal in the world of work? And I would like to think that there's a level of wisdom that people bring into the world of work that can't be garnered anyplace else. So everyone is struggling with how do we handle our business transformation, but at the same time enable people to still contribute and grow and be part of our future, but also help shape our future. So it is widespread and it is everywhere. So that's my first comment. My second is more specific, and I think you and I were chatting about this last week a bit, which is this topic around leadership development. It's another area of research where anytime I maybe do a keynote or an industry briefing about this, those that are in the field of leadership development find this to be particularly interesting, that there are some very clear patterns around how power affects cognition. And we see it in the marketplace today. We see it in industry. We see it in the media. We see it in politics. We see it sort of, everywhere. And it's almost a little bit therapeutic, honestly, that when I start to describe these trends in a larger group setting, people start looking side to side at one another as if they know who we're talking about. Like I'm talking about a particular leader in their organization. But the reason I bring it up is that there are things that we know about how power affects cognition. And if I were doing hypo leadership development or any kind of like early career discussions with people about as your career grows, as you get more access to resource or budget or colleagues, whatever the case might be, decision making, there are some things that you should know about how power actually affects the brain and some counterbalances to that. And so the three sort of domains, we won't go deeply, but the three domains are you become more optimistic, you become more goal-oriented, and you become more visionary. And on the surface, those sound like really good things. The problem is the converse of that you focus less on people, you focus less on details, and you become more immune to risk. And we see these things play out in decision making, and there are ways to offset it. So it's just another one of those very practical, tangible examples of early career for your leaders to have people understand that it is natural for power to make you feel a certain way. And so your job then as a leader becomes to make sure you're doing all the right things that counterbalance what the brain is doing to you and for you without you ever asking for it to happen.
Interesting. It's a little bit like the conversation earlier about biases. Like it exists. It's there in the world. Your job, if anything, is to recognize when you're a victim of it and when it's causing you to do things that may actually be not in the best interests of yourself or the organization.
Correct. You have read the tea leaves accurately.
Cool. Anything else that excites you about the future of L&D? I think it's very well said, by the way, that people who are paying attention, interesting phrase, but people who are paying attention are anxious about the role of L&D in the future. It is an exciting time, but it's also a daunting time because there's so much change in the workplace coming, and there's so much interest and attention in these things. There's a lot of work for us to collectively do. Yeah. Are there other things that excite you about the future of L&D?
Well, so if I were a CLO again, and forklifting from 20 years ago and fast forwarding, one of the biggest differences I see that actually is an opportunity. It's just a matter of framing your brain around it that way and thinking of it in this regard. But there's just so little need for anyone in learning to think of themselves as a controlling function